Welcome to the HMO Property Show by investors for investors. Brought to you by the HMO Property Co, Australia's leaders in impact investing. Investments made with the intention to generate a measurable, beneficial social or environmental impact alongside a positive financial return. Catch us weekly as we discuss all things cash flow positive property investing.
Welcome back to the HMO Property Show, and today I've got a very special guest all the way from the UK. She's not in Western Australia, but she has been in Brisbane just recently. It's Wendy Whittaker-Large. Welcome to the podcast, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yes, indeed, I did visit your beautiful country just a few weeks ago, really. I only got back sort of middle of August, and I'm already yearning to come back.
It's a beautiful place, isn't it?
It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I loved Australia. I can't stop talking about it, so don't get me started, because people just get so bored of me going on and on and on about how wonderful Australia is.
Is there many people in the UK still talking about making the move across to Australia at the minute?
Well, I think lots of people probably consider it every year, and certainly from time to time, we do hear of people going. In fact, I've actually got a friend who's an HMO investor who's seriously looking at the moment. She's flying out in a few weeks' time to identify where they might live. So it is happening. I don't think it's quite happening perhaps in the droves that it was happening maybe a few years ago, but there's lots of things going on in the UK that people aren't happy about. And one of the things that no government, no king, no prime minister can change is the weather. No matter what they might try and say, with all their climate promises, they cannot change the weather. And Australia has that very big benefit that you have lovely, lovely weather. And even when we were with you in July and August, people were saying, well, it's a bit cold now because it's winter. You're going to have to get your jumpers on because it's a bit cold around Brisbane. And I thought, this is the height of summer.
Yeah.
Have you been to the UK? This is better than our summer. So no, I was really delighted. I suspect in your summer it probably does get very, very hot though. Maybe I'd find that a little bit difficult to cope with. But yeah, generally we just thought it was an amazing place.
It does get a bit intense in the summer. Apart from the weather though, do you feel like the culture, do you think it's much of a culture change or shock to move from the UK to Australia? And do you think we live in any different way to what you do back there?
Well, of course, I was only there for a few weeks, 3 weeks, so I can only comment on a very short stay. My eldest son lives in Brisbane, so he's been there for 4 years now, and so he has a little bit more experience. Also, he's been in Sydney and Melbourne. He's travelled around a bit and lived in different places. I feel that it feels a little bit like the UK used to be. When I come to Australia, it felt very much almost like coming home in some ways, because the people, the attitudes, they are fairly traditional British family values. You trust each other, you work together, you communicate, you do business together, you benefit from a free market, you people are enterprising. If somebody has an idea to start up a business or a shop, they can do it without too much difficulty. It feels to me like people take responsibility for their lives. They're encouraged to make progress in their own lives, and so investing is part and parcel of that. And I know your investing strategies and investing regime is slightly different from ours in the UK due to various different factors. But it felt to me more relaxed. Even when it came, for example, to renting a car, we rented a motorhome and we rented a car. Both times, it was so easy. I just had to produce my driving license and all the paperwork was there, and I just signed it. We did a quick tour around the car. And when I brought the car back a week later, they just kind of checked it over and said, yeah, it looks fine. Looks like you cleaned it. That's great. Signed it off. I got my deposit back. Hey ho. Now, if that was the UK, I would have been there for half a day, filling out this form and that form, having to do this collision damage waiver, extra insurance, and, all of these extra bits of regulation that slow down business. And I don't think until you get out of the UK, do you realise how Well, actually, from an Australian point of view, I don't think you perhaps realise how lucky you are being in a fairly low regulated environment. It might not feel like that to you, but compared to the UK, I feel there's a massive contrast. And the other thing was when we arrived in Brisbane Airport after being in Singapore, it was lovely. You know, it's lovely and sunny and it's beautiful. And we went to the cafe and had a lovely breakfast. And the friendliness of the staff, the service levels, immediately I thought this is a massive contrast to the UK, where people are mostly grumpy and have forgotten to smile. And also in the UK, when we flew home, the first thing I saw was abuse to our staff will not be tolerated. You must do this, you must do this, walk on the right, walk on the left, you know, all of these rules and regulations. And there's signs everywhere to tell you what to do. And I thought, you know, immediately you arrive in the UK, you're being bossed around. And as an entrepreneur, I'm afraid to say my biggest value is freedom. And so the one thing I don't want to be is bossed around. And I could feel myself getting annoyed. Even though, I mean, I hadn't had much sleep, so that was probably another factor. But there was a real contrast in that. So these are small subtleties that I'm not sure that people necessarily realize are there, but I certainly noticed them. And I think that's why I just so fell in love with Australia, because I felt that your economy is geared up for people to make a success of their lives and have families and do well and prosper. Whereas I just don't feel that the UK economy has got that on its radar at the moment, and it's slipping down a terrible slope.
That's the main reason that I moved to this country as well. I left in 2010 off the back of the GFC, and I just seen everything was just getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and came over here and it was just beautiful. And we got the weather as well, so it was brilliant.
Absolutely, Neil.
So the way that we live in Australia, you said there, it feels a little bit more relaxed. And the reason that I like speaking to people in the UK, especially investors that are investing in HMOs, is so we can kind of get a comparison of the way that you invest back there and the way that people live back in the UK, just to compare it to the way that people are living in Western Australia and Australia in general, because traditionally in Western Australia, or the Australian dream, was to buy the house on the big block of land and have the big back garden so that it could raise the family, like you said. But due to the demand of people wanting to move into the country, it's pushed the price of the real estate to unaffordable for a lot of people that are out there right now. And the houses have got bigger and bigger, but the people that live in them are getting smaller. So on average, we've got 2.5 people living in a property. It's actually 2.3 people. I don't know how they get the 0.3, but 2.3 people on average living in a property. That's 256 square meters.
Yes. A lot of space for very few people.
Yeah. So we've got these big houses and only a few people living in them. And a lot of that property that we've been bringing to the market in the way of rental stock has been the 4x2. That's 4 bedroom, 2 bathroom, 256 square meters. And we, as the HMO Property Co, started buying these properties for our clients and chopping them up into smaller rooms, putting kitchenettes, en suites in them, and then renting them out individually and getting double or triple the rent, which is exactly what you guys do in the UK, isn't that right?
Absolutely, it's exactly the same idea. It's about maximizing the floor space really of the property.
Yeah. So how do you do that in the UK then? Are the properties as big as what I'm explaining over here, and is there as much demand over there? Because the has been there for a while now, hasn't it? It was introduced by the government back in the 80s. Am I right?
Well, really, if you look back at the history of the housing market in the UK, we've always had a form of this kind of living where you take a large property and you split it up into individual compartments and people live in them. If you go back to Victorian times, Dickensian England, this is one of the problems that Dickens was talking about, which he wrote about, was the slums, and that people were living in these high-rise buildings, which were slum living, really. There was very little provision for them, very little amenities, and it was for the poorest people to live there. And that idea of taking a large building and splitting it up into separate areas, separate sort of compartmentalized living, has been around for a long time. But really, I think it was the student market where this started to become a little bit more embedded. So in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, when student population was steadily growing, And higher education was becoming more of a sort of aspirational thing to do. Lots of areas, new colleges sprang up, colleges of further education and higher education, and then you also had something called polytechnics, which is more a sort of practical type university degree, and then you had universities, which they're all now called universities, but if you go back in time, they were slightly more sort of graded really as to the kind of courses that they offered. Well, students obviously had to live somewhere, and many of these courses just these universities or colleges didn't have enough accommodation. So local people would often offer up a room in their house or a couple of rooms in their house. And I think what happened was that people began to realize there was an opportunity here to make some money. If you could buy a house that was maybe, say, 100 square meters, it might have 3 bedrooms in it, maybe a couple of reception rooms downstairs, a kitchen and a bathroom. Well, if you could put a bed and a wardrobe and a desk into those 2 reception rooms and the 3 bedrooms, rent them each out for probably £50 a week or something at that stage, it would not only cover the cost of a mortgage that you had, but also any bills. And actually students generally, the sort of culture in this country is that students sort out their own utility bills, so the landlord doesn't pay for those. So all the landlord would do was really offer a very basic service, say that's your room, pay for it, let's say on a termly basis when you get your grant or your student loan, and thank you very much indeed. I'm off to Ibiza or the Maldives or maybe Perth even. And so this kind of student HMO became very much embedded in the lifestyle of the typical student. But I think what happened was that investors then began to see that actually there was an opportunity to offer this kind of living to young professionals who'd maybe just graduated. They were moving into big cities, but again, the stretch to not just affording their own place, but also paying for all the bills and the sense of isolation of living on your own. Lots of people don't like living alone. They much more enjoy living in a bit of a community. And the benefit of HMOs is that it isn't just about the cost is cheaper, it's more affordable to live there. It's actually also that you have a social environment. Now, obviously, that has pros and cons depending on who you live with. Mm-hmm. And certainly, we've had many situations where tenants have complained about their fellow housemates not being as clean and tidy as they are, or cooking food that smells the whole house out, or smoking out inside when they are not allowed to. And there are some of those antisocial problems that do crop up from time to time, which I think is why HMOs definitely are a little bit more high maintenance than, say, a single family property that you might rent out. But on the other hand, if you can get a good group of people together and they can get on, reasonably well, and they stick to the house rules and they understand the importance of, sort of reining in their own behaviour to be able to live in a sort of conducive environment for everybody, they can be incredibly effective places to live. And we've got tenants who've been with us for 5 or 6 years, living in an HMO room. And many of those don't have their own bathrooms. They don't have an ensuite bathroom. Many do, but we have quite a few that don't. They share the kitchen. They've got their own cupboard in the kitchen. They've got their shelf in their fridge and their freezer. They've got space to store their own items. It's definitely more restricted than if it's your own flat or your own apartment or a house. There's no doubt about it. But I also think that people have got more used to living compactly. Again, it's quite interesting, isn't it? If you look at other trends, I suppose, in the UK, one of the problems has been we haven't had enough house building for many, many, many years, not just the last couple of years, not just since COVID, but for many years, we have not built enough houses. Now, I don't blame the government for that, although I think there is a responsibility in terms of planning law to enable developers to build houses, and often they're stopped because of restrictive planning laws. But I think there's lots of other reasons why. Again, people in the UK don't want to have their back gardens or plots of land built on. They don't like the idea of not in my backyard. It's called NIMBYism, and that has held back development. But there's lots of other reasons as well. The cost of building, of course, is one, and again, regulations. It all adds to the cost of building, and so therefore, not only do we have a squeeze on the housing market, We've also had a slight shift, if you like, if you might say, in terms of people's conception of living. And for example, companies like IKEA. Now, that is a great company if you live in a small flat or a small apartment, because they do lots of space saving devices. You know, their big thrust was to to be able to help people who live in apartments. I think initially probably in Sweden. In fact, we've been to the head office at in Sweden. I think it's in Malmo, and it's really interesting because that it sort of traces the history of IKEA, and their idea was of flat pack furniture, which is easy to assemble, not too expensive. So if you're a young couple just starting off, you know, you can buy a wardrobe, you can buy a chest of drawers, and within, you know, a day, you've basically furnished your apartment with new furniture that's cost effective, but also
Quick.
has all these different sort of quick, exactly, exactly. And it hasn't cost you an arm and a leg, you know. So I think, and other things, you know, technological innovations. You know, if you think about nowadays, a lot of people live their lives on their mobile phone. They don't even have a laptop or a desktop PC. You know, years ago, I would have had a computer. You remember those tower blocks that you used to have? And they'd sit under the desk, and you'd have a keyboard and all the rest of it. But that's a load of kit, isn't it? Where's that kit going to go? Well, nowadays I could maybe just have an iPad and an iPhone, and I'm sorted. You know, I'm much more mobile. So I do think there's been shifts, cultural shifts that have played into the HMO revolution as well. And I think we may forget those at our peril, that people who don't understand how HMOs work don't realize there's loads of adaptations that individual tenants make to be able to sort of almost constrain themselves to living in a bedroom with a shared kitchen and a shared bathroom.
What have you seen changes in the way people live and the way that you design HMOs? How long have you been doing HMOs? Is it 2013?
Well, my very first built property I ever bought was actually a student HMO.
Yep.
About a mile from where I live, and it was because we had a local college. So just as I explained, you know, a little bit earlier about the history of that, I was one of those landlords who bought a 5-bed HMO, and there were 5 students in it, and I literally just went every term and got the money, got the rent from them, and did very little to the property. But that changed because the college closed down, so there were no more students. So we turned it into a family buy-to-let, and we still have it now, and it's still a family buy-to-let. Fast forward to 2012, and I'm teaching at, funnily enough, at the university, a local university in the other direction. And I was really fed up with my job. I was really busy. I had 4 children by then. Andy, my husband, was working away in London during the week. So I was like a single mum, Monday to Friday. And I just knew I needed to do something to get out of the rat race. And you know, when you have that kind of desire, that feeling like I've got to do something, like you said, to replace your income. And for me, it was getting out of that pressure of always having to swap my time for money. And I read Robert Kiyosaki. As I say, I had a few single buy-to-let properties by then, but all of them were bought with the intention of providing me with a pension when I was much older, or a legacy for my children. I hadn't really thought about how I could actually make cash flow, you know, income from property. I'd just always seen it as being something for the future. So I came across this book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, by Robert Kiyosaki. Everybody else in the property world seems to have read it, but at that stage I'd never even heard of it. I got the book, I devoured it, and I thought, wow, I could actually become financially free from investing in property if I do things a little differently, if I have a different mindset, and if I have a different strategy. So I started by doing a 4-bed HMO in Crewe, which is a few miles to the west of where we live. And it just sold out within about a week. All the rooms were gone. And I was making about £700 a month profit, which was probably 2 or 3 times what I would have made if I turned that property into a family letting.
Yep.
And I kind of got the bug. So I did a second property, which is a 7-bed HMO, and then I ran out of money. And so I was stuck because I didn't have any more money to invest with. But just having those 2 properties, just having that track record of having done 2, enabled me to then find an investor. And with that investor, we set up our own company. I did a joint venture with him and we did 6 projects together. Then I met another investor. We did 5 projects together. Then another investor, and we've done 3 projects together. And it just kind of grew and grew and grew and grew. And then alongside that growing, although it was a 50-50, so I wasn't getting 100% of the profit, I was only making 50%. Of course, what I had was a model. I had a kind of template to be able to grow the business. And by that stage, of course, I had become financially free. I became financially free in 2015. And Andy, my husband, also left his job and joined me in the business. So we could then do some of our own projects, just the 2 of us, which were then, 100% income for us. And we just kind of expanded and expanded. And we set up a lettings agency as well to manage the rooms. So we now have a team who manages that for us. And we've gone into other things. We've done commercial conversions. We've got blocks of flats. We've got pieces of land. We've got lots of other things that we are involved in as well now. But it started with HMOs. And for me, the key was getting myself out of my job. That was all I wanted to do. That was my goal, that I could make enough money so that I didn't have to work for somebody else. And then I could choose what I did with my time. Because when you've got your time back, it's the one resource you can't make any more of. So I knew that I could make more money. I could increase my energy by living and eating well and sleeping well. I could grow my property portfolio. I could even, if I wanted to, and I was mad enough, have more children. But I think really 4 boys is enough for any woman to cope with.
So
what I couldn't make any more of was time.
It all started with that first one, didn't it, though? That's the main thing. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, because they don't even take that first step into that first property. And that first one, cash flow positive, and I was the same. I did the first one, I did the second one, I did the third one. Before you know it, you're at a point where you can step away from your job and you've got an extra 10 hours a day that you used to allocate somewhere else. And when you've got 10 hours a day additional, it's amazing how fast that journey can accelerate, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it makes such a difference, because suddenly you're free to do all the things in property that you wished you could do. And also you have time to do some of the other things that you didn't have time for before. So running, I took up running. I'd always wanted to run the London Marathon, and in my job, I just never had time to train. There's no way I could have trained for a marathon when I was working, even when I was working part-time. But I took up running, and I've run the London Marathon twice, and I've run the Great North Run, and I've done some other big runs. Awesome. And so I enjoy keeping fit, and I do things in my local community as well. And I've been able to help out at various different youth organizations, and do all the good things that, again, you need time to be able to do, but you also need income to support you while you're doing those things.
There's a strong focus in Australia on capital growth. A lot of people like to invest in high growth areas so that they can leverage into more and more properties. But the problem that we've got with this traditional rental market is the yields are sitting between like 3 and 5%. In Sydney, they're probably 2%, but the capital growth that them guys have got is huge. Problem that they've got over there is they can't get access to that equity because the borrowing capacity is so low, because the returns are a minimal 2%. Would you invest for capital growth? Do you invest for cash flow? Do you invest for both?
Initially, I only invested for cash flow, because in the UK, probably similar to Australia, but in the UK, we definitely have a north-south divide. Maybe yours is an east-west divide. But in the UK, we tend to find that properties in the south that are nearer London do much better in terms of capital growth. Now, that means obviously they're harder to buy because they're usually more expensive. Price per square metre in London is probably 15 times what it is here. But the issue is that here, you're not going to get so much capital growth. So you might get, at the moment, I think we're getting maybe 5% per annum. We have had years where I think post-COVID, it was 12%. We had a big increase in capital values post-COVID because of inflation. But most years, 3 to 5% would be a sort of fairly standard increase that I would expect. Whereas in the south, their market is a bit more volatile, but they can go 15 or 20% one year, and then 10% the next, 3% the next, 2% the next, 11% the next. It's a little bit more of a sort of roller coaster.
Hold on
But
tight.
overall, if you keep a property for 10 years, if I'd bought in London 10 years ago, then I'd have a property probably 15 times what it was valued 10 years ago. So it's very, very good for capital growth. But as you say, if you're using the capital within that property to buy the next one and you're needing to leverage it, you get stuck. There's a point where you get stuck when you can't do it anymore. And if the yield of that property is not going to give you sufficient coverage for the additional loan, and of course at the moment we know with interest rates going up, loans are also more expensive, then you're basically going to be in a negative cash flow situation. Now, I know that in Australia you've got this negative gearing policy which allows you to claim it back on your tax return, which we don't have in the UK. But I would say in the UK there are many more opportunities because rentals are generally higher. On the whole, they're higher proportionately to the cost of property because we have so few properties. So this means that generally you should be able to be cash flow positive. The only issue that we have in the UK is something called Section 24, which is effectively a tax burden that was brought in a few years ago, about 6 years ago, which means that if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you cannot claim any more than 20% of your interest costs on a mortgage. So in a normal business, let's say I ran a corner shop, a shop, let's say a grocery shop or something, and I was selling, fruit and vegetables and sweets and newspapers and what have you. If I had a loan on that shop, I'd be able to claim all the interest cost against my income before my profit was calculated and my tax was paid. Now, that's how property investing used to be in the UK. So if you had a property, you had a mortgage on it, let's say the mortgage cost you £100 a month, maybe you had just an interest-only mortgage. At the end of the year, you do your tax return, and £1,200, which is 12 times £100, which is your interest cost, all of that will be deducted from your costs or deducted from your income before you then finalised your profit. Yeah. Well, now, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you can only claim 20% of that. So obviously, when it happened, everybody was up in arms. It was not good, and still people to this day talk about it, and it's a reason why lots of people have got out of the market, partly because, of course, personal allowances have not gone up, whereas rents have gone up. So the gap between being a higher rate taxpayer and the risk of this happening is minimal now. Most people will fall into this trap if they're investing in property. So you have to do it through a limited company. Yes. Because a limited company allows you to claim 100% of your interest costs. But of course, there's problems in terms of withdrawing the income. You have to pay tax on the income that you withdraw. So tax-wise, it's more, I think the UK has become a complex environment to invest in, much more so than it used to be. It's still possible. And I think this is where HMOs really fit in very well, because you want something that's going to give you good cash flow. In my estimation, what's the point of investing if all you're doing is waiting for the never, never? If you're just waiting for that future day when suddenly, the fairy godmother of investing is going to appear on your doorstep and say, Wendy, your property portfolio is worth £10 million. Well, by then I'll probably be sort of, 92. And I mean, I might still be running marathons. Let's hope it. But, what can I do with it then? I've maybe got 8 years left to live. Well, too late then, isn't it? My kids have all grown up. My grandchildren have all grown up. My husband's popped off because he's probably going to die because he's that's what happens, isn't it? Women live longer than men. And I'm going to be there 92 hobbling around, or maybe not hobbling around, doing my training, running the next London Marathon. But how am I going to spend £10 million? So it's, to me, that whole idea about waiting, constantly delaying gratification, which is generally a very good trait to have if you're an investor, to delay your gratification. It's a very good skill, and too few people have it. But there has to be a reason why you're investing. And there's nothing wrong with investing for the future. Like I say, that was how I started. But I think if you want to change your life, if you want to get your time back, you have to do it with cash flow, not with capital growth.
Love that. Love it. We're speaking the same language, Wendy. Not because we're both from the UK, but because we're both on the cash flow bus, like singing from the rooftops. You mentioned there as well, where you invest compared to London, it's different price point, different capital growth, different cash flows, I'm assuming different room rents and stuff like that. What's the catchment area like that you invest in? Because you invest in a certain area, don't you?
Yes, our investment area is probably about 20 miles sort of east to west, I would say. The area is maybe 25 miles east to west.
Yeah.
And then it's a fairly kind of small band. It's maybe sort of 3 miles, sort of from north to south, if you like. And it's that whole band where we invest. And population wise, I would say it's probably about 200, 300, maybe about 400,000 people in our whole area where we invest. Not even, I wouldn't even say 500,000. It's probably not quite as high as 500,000 population. And yeah, there's lots of demand for rooms. I think one of the benefits is where we live, both of those two areas, Stoke-on-Trent and Crewe, have got a very strong industrial heritage. So there's lots of factories, there's lots of kind of hotels, bars, shops, retail. We have quite a lot of industries that are based on transport. We have quite a lot of transportation of goods, those kind of businesses. We've got, Bentley, for example, Bentley Motor Cars is based in Crewe. So we quite often have apprentices or even engineers who are coming for maybe a 6-month placement or a year's placement at Bentley, and they come and live in one of our properties because again, they don't want to rent something like an apartment or a flat or a house because of all the commitment to then having to sort out all the bills and the admin headache of doing that if they're just living for 6 months. So coming to an HMO where everything is all included and they just simply move in, and all they need to do is bring some bedding and their clothes, and they can just move in and live because everything else is provided for them. It makes it easy, doesn't it? It makes it simple. Yeah. So yeah, we have a lot of tenants who are working in medical profession as well. There's a large teaching hospital in Stoke, so we have a lot of medics that we house in Stoke. We have quite a few people who work in the care sector, people who are working in, as I say, transportation, retail, hospitality, those kind of areas. So yeah, probably not too dissimilar from Perth in some ways. But yeah, we have a lot of people who are from all sorts of different industries. They're not all, on basic wages. Some of them are on quite good salaries. We do probably have more people who are on, the basic minimum wage because HMOs are therefore affordable for them. We also find, though, that we have people who, for example, are going through a divorce or, relationship breakdown, and they're no longer living with their partner and they need somewhere to move into quickly that's going to give them some kind of a base. And they don't want to go to a hotel or a bed and breakfast because it's a bit too short term. It makes sense to move into an HMO for 6 months. We've got a couple of retired people, a couple of retired blokes who found themselves in not very suitable accommodation and ended up staying with us. So one of them is sort of almost like the grandfather of the house, and he sort of looks after the property, and he's always there, and if there's a problem, he'll let us know, and he looks after things. So that's actually quite nice. It gives the house a bit of stability. So there's lots of different types of tenants out there. Sometimes you just don't know. You have in your mind. So when I started, I was marketing to young professionals. Well, our remit has just grown and grown and grown because they're not all young and they're not all professional.
Yeah, same.
But our offering is not for students, though. We are quite clear that we don't, unless you're a postgraduate student, which is slightly different. But if you're an undergraduate student, we don't offer accommodation to you because there's plenty of other student accommodation on offer that's more suited to students, but also because our service provision isn't quite really geared up for students. They've got slightly different needs and requirements, so it doesn't really suit students. And we don't offer accommodation to people who are unemployed either. You have to be, well, these, of course, apart from these two retired men who have pensions, so they pay their rent by their pension. But that, again, that's slightly different, and they were a bit of an exception to the rule. But generally, we find that these are working people. I would say it's 70-30 male female. Definitely, we have more men than we do have women, and they are in those kind of jobs. And our average length of stay, because we track our statistics every month, our average length of stay is 26 months in our HMO rooms. So it's more than 2 years. That's the average. So obviously we've got some people who move in and move out maybe after a year. We have, as I say, other people who've been there for years and years and years, long stay tenants. And so, it's good. And it shows. We also have just recently done a tenant survey. We surveyed all our tenants to find out what they liked, what they didn't like, what was good, what was bad, what we could improve on. And 80% of them said they would recommend living in an HMO from Best Nest. So that was really good. And of course, a lot of them used the survey to be able to say, this needs improving, this needs improving, there's a problem with the fridge, or my shower head isn't powerful enough, or whatever. You were always going to get a few grumbles, because imagine if you've got nothing else to do on a Friday night but sit in your room, you're going to find what's wrong with it, and you're going to let the landlord know because you're bored out of your head.
Yeah, but all
but yeah,
feedback
exactly.
is good feedback, isn't it? Whether it's positive or negative, we can use that feedback to provide better service. So you mentioned Best Nest there. That's your property management business. How many HMOs do you have under management in there?
Oh, that's a very good question. In total, we have over 210 units. So I don't know actually how many that breaks down into separate properties. I'd have to go and have a look at that.
210 rooms.
Yes, 210 rooms. Yeah, that's right. Sure. So we have, and then on top of that, we also have single buy-to-lets, and we've got flats, and we've got commercial. We have a pub as well that we own. That's very little management actually, which is good. So yeah, the way that we do our statistics every month, Neil, is we look at the number of individual units, the rooms, rather than looking at the actual properties, because what we found is that we've got a 9-bed HMO, we've got a couple of 7 beds, we've got some 6 beds, 5 beds, 4 beds. We used to have a couple of 3-bed HMOs. Have we got any 3 beds at the moment? No, we haven't got any 3 beds. I think we owned a couple of 3 beds, and we turned them back into family buy-to-lets, because the family buy-to-let rental market had also grown, and we realized that it was actually better for those to be family properties rather than small HMOs. So the minimum number we now have in a small HMO is 4. Those work very well. We find those work very well. Again, it's all about the price point. If you buy them at the right price, you refurbish them nicely, and you have you have good management, then the tenants stay and they pay, and they have a nice little kind of community feel in those properties.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, Wendy, that there's about 400,000 people that live in the catchment area, Stoke, Crewe, in the section in between. And you said it was roughly 20 miles wide. So whilst you were talking, I quickly checked on my phone for a converter, because we work in kilometres over here. And that works out to be 32 kilometres. So for the people that are listening, it's probably Perth to Kwinana in the south, or from Perth to Joondalup in the north. So that's just for the people that are listening there, because although you've got 210 units in your property management business, how many rooms do you think there is in this total Stoke and Crewe area?
Well, I would say 15,000.
15,000 rooms.
That's 15,000 rooms. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say probably a third of those would be student rooms. Maybe not even as much as a third, actually. Maybe 3,000 or 4,000 would be student rooms, but the rest will be either professional rooms, or they will be what we call supported living, which is for people who are needing some support. They're normally on unemployment benefits, or they're on what we call universal credit, which is our benefit system here in the UK. But yeah, it's huge. It's absolutely huge, and we're constantly looking to take on more properties from people. landlords that are investing in those areas, if you're not happy with your current agent, please contact me because we would be delighted to take it on. And we get new referrals all the time from people who aren't happy with their current agent. And this year we've taken on quite a few properties from other people, not just HMOs, actually, single buy-to-lets as well. Because maybe because the agents just don't have the time or the attention to detail or the knowledge or the experience, frankly, to be able to manage HMOs well. And but I think we do. I think it's a specialist area. It's a niche area. You have to know what you're doing. It's not as straightforward as a single buy-to-let. So yeah, we are proud with our sort of track record and history of occupancy and profitability and management services that we provide to our clients.
Brilliant. I'm kind of blown away by the amount of rooms that are in such a, what I would consider a small area, because when I spoke about the two suburbs, just to give the listeners comparison there, like we've got 600 rooms spread across Perth Metro now. It's probably 40 k's to the south and 40 k's to the north, so like an 80-kilometer all up, which is probably about 40 or 50 miles, and we've got 600 rooms. And some people consider or questioning the fact whether we would saturate the market with rooms at 600 rooms.
Yeah, it's very different, isn't it, the perception? Partly, I think that probably in Australia, the culture of living in an HMO is different, and it may not be quite as kind of established as it is in the UK. I think now, I mean, we've got sites like Spare Room. Now, Spare Room is what's called a flat sharing website, and really anybody who wants to either rent a room or advertise a room would use Spare Room. It's the main way in which we advertise rooms. It's just about rooms. Now, if you don't have something like that in Australia, you almost don't have some infrastructure that we've got. So we've got maybe some infrastructure. I think also in terms of lending, there's a lot more mortgage companies that will lend on HMOs. There's a lot more flexibility in terms of buying HMOs. One of the struggles currently is actually finding the properties to convert into HMOs. We just don't have enough properties on the market. People aren't selling. There's a real sort of blockage in the housing market at the moment. But yeah, people have often said to me as well, Wendy, do you think the market is saturated? And I always say to them, well, saturation is only when you've got that balance between supply and demand. You've got the same amount of supply as you have demand. And if you were to supply more into the market, it wouldn't sell because the demand isn't there. So one of the things that you have to do is create demand. If you want to grow your business, you've got to create your own demand. So how do you do that? Well, you develop a great product that people want to buy. You develop it for a great value proposition, so it's worth their money to pay for it. And you also provide them with a great service so that your brand is important. And then people, a bit like the iPhone, when Steve Jobs came out with the iPhone, it was revolutionary because of the way that it worked with apps. It didn't have a keyboard on it. It's a very, very different type of phone. He created demand because of the product. And Henry Ford, when it's a lovely quote about cars, he was the Ford car founder and manufacturer, and he said, if I'd given people what they wanted, they would have asked for faster horses. And so in other words, you have to sometimes create your own demand by creating a product that people are going to love and want. And so I think that possibly in Australia, you're just at the sort of cusp of starting this living revolution. It's like an HMO revolution, isn't it, where you're having to educate people not only about what an HMO is. If I mean, you might not even want to use that phrase, house of multiple occupation. It seems a little bit kind of formal to me, shared living or co-living or something like that. Yeah. But the idea that people live together in a small community, they pay one amount of rent which covers all their bills, there's no hassle, they don't have to bring anything because all the kitchen equipment, the utilities, etc., are all provided. So it's just easy living for a straightforward way of life. And that's how we always marketed our rooms, was just move in and live. And our strapline was just like a hotel, only it's a home. But the problem was that then people started to want room service, and we said, no, we don't offer room service. So we had to change that. Not a good strap line. But the idea behind it was that we were sort of educating people about this way of living.
Yes. As you're talking, Wendy, we are having the exact same problems here. There's not enough properties on the market. There's so much demand out there. We can't do them fast enough. People don't know what they want till you give them it. I mean, we finish houses and we take investors through them, and they're like, oh my God, I had no idea it would look like this. The tenants, we're renting 6-bedroom houses out within a week. At the minute, we're renting them out for a lot more than what we put in the initial feasibility as well, because the demand's just insane. So it's good to hear that we are having the same problems that you're having as well. And I think to finish the podcast, it would be great, you did touch on it just briefly there, to hear more about the lending and how the lending landscape has changed in the HMO space. Because right now there's only one lender in the whole of Australia that will lend on HMOs at a good LVR. There's lenders there that will do 50 and 60%, but there's one that will do 80 and 90% at the minute.
Right. Okay, fine. Yeah, so standard HMO lending would be 75%, what you call LVR, we call LVT. And basically, I would say, so one of the issues with HMOs is that they are considered to be a commercial product, even though it's a residential property. And the bigger you go and the more extensive your renovation or the change that you've made to the building, the more likely it is you will actually get funding. So funnily enough, the more expensive, the bigger a development you undertake, the more likelihood it is that you will get finance for that building. And that's just because lenders don't necessarily want to lend on lots of small projects. They'd rather lend on a few larger projects. But even for people who are starting off maybe with a 5 or 6 bed HMO, there are still plenty of lenders out there, even high street lenders. You can go to a high street bank and get a mortgage for an HMO. It will take time. That's one thing that we see in the UK is the conveyancing and the paperwork for finance is, oh dear, just don't hold your breath, because it will take weeks to happen. Yeah. And they want to know everything about you, including your inside leg measurement. But if you can sort of grit your teeth and get through all of that, then there is finance available. Now, the lenders are often not just looking at the property, they're looking at you as a borrower. So they're de-risking their lending by assessing you. So if you've got some experience already, that really does help in the UK, because they love to lend to what they call experienced landlords. But their definition of an experienced landlord might be to hold a single buy-to-let for 1 year. That's a single family let.
Yep.
Or it might be to have 3 properties, or you've got to find out what they mean by an experienced landlord. Definitely, I think that if you can, if you've got a good, you've got good paperwork behind you, so you've got a clear budget, you know what the rooms are going to rent out at, you've done your paperwork, you've treated it like a business. I know that lenders are much more open to listening when they've got a person who's serious about this, and they're not just doing it as a hobby. And I think going into HMOs, you've got to realise you are starting a new business, albeit a small business. You might only want 5 of these. I always said to myself, if I could get 5 HMOs, that would cover my day-to-day income. That's all I needed, was 5 properties. Unlike if I'd had buy-to-lets, when I would have probably needed 30 properties, but 5 of these properties would get me out of my job. In fact, I think after about 3, I got out of my job because the profit was so good. And after 5, Andy got out of his job. So we did it much sooner than we anticipated. But yeah, the key is to treat it like a business, because then you can open yourself up to lots more people in the marketplace, and also to have a good commercial mortgage broker. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that mortgages for HMOs in the UK, depending on the size of them, will be based on their income, not just on the value of the bricks and mortar. So traditional valuations for properties are done on the value of the land, the freehold, the location, the bricks and mortar, and the surveyor or the valuer will give a value based on all of those factors. The internal layout, the features of the property, the standard. Whereas with an HMO, they are looking at the income. because they treat it as a commercial valuation. So they will do what's called a multiplier on the basis of the income of that property. So it's just worth bearing in mind it's calculated slightly differently. And in some places, you actually might be better off with a bricks and mortar valuation than a commercial valuation, because you'll get higher on the bricks and mortar than you would on the commercial. But yeah, in terms of mortgages, there's lots and lots more lenders, and I couldn't even tell you. I'd probably say there's 15 lenders in the UK that would lend on HMOs, and there may even be more than that. I'm not a mortgage broker, so you'd have to speak to a mortgage broker to find that out. But I know all the time, I get newsletters from various different mortgage brokers saying, oh, this bank has now released this product, or this bank has now released this product. So there's quite a lot out there.
Yeah. And again, it sounds very, very similar to what's happening here. They do a commercial valuation for these properties that we're doing.
Yeah.
But it's actually a residential lending package. So it's kind of like a hybrid mortgage that we get, which is really good, because we've got some people that have purchased established properties, converted them, and then refinanced with the HMO lender. So just use a normal lender to start with, then use the HMO lender and pulled some of their equity back out and some of the conversion costs back out. And then for the new builds that we do, because we've got a chronic shortage of housing here and we need to build more houses, we just go straight to the HMO lender and they look at the cash flow that the property produces. Again, they use a multiplier, which gives it the value, and the borrower can borrow 80 and sometimes 90% from the bank.
Yeah, good.
So we're catching up, Wendy. Last thing before
well, you've got more. You obviously have more units than we have. You're 3 times the amount of units, and it looks like you've got ability to sort of expand if you can get those properties. And I think that's the same with us. I think one of the issues that we face in the UK is people are maybe this is true in Australia as well, but I think there is I sense that people are reluctant to invest in property in the UK. Lots of changes have happened. There's lots of regulation. There's lots of kind of legislative issues. Tax is another big one, and I just get the sense that people are not so excited about investing as they once were. The opportunities that once were there, I think a lot of people are a bit more circumspect about it. So in terms of investors, landlords, even the numbers have really diminished over the last few years, and we've seen that in our business. We've seen that our growth has been a bit curtailed because of that. Having said that, we still do pretty well in what we have, but I think that I think the age of the HMO market in the UK is kind of they people give these kind of growth startup. I can't quite remember all those different phases of a business, but I think in terms of where the market is in the UK, it's a bit more mature, the HMO market, than it is maybe in Australia. So you need to benefit from that. You need to benefit from that growth wave before you get to that point where people are a bit more cynical and a bit more not sure about it, which is I kind of feel where people are at the moment in the UK. And that may change again, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, great. Wendy, we've been chatting for 52 minutes already. I just want to quickly ask you about your 2 books that you've got, because you're an author as well, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, tell us about the book.
In fact, I've got them here. Oh no, I've actually just sent one. Oh no, here it is. Let me just reach over and get it. So yeah, I've got 2 books. This is sorry, it's a bit blurry screen. This is the first one, 101 Essential Tips for Running a Professional HMO. So I wrote that book after I had systemized our business, because our business is a little bit of it's all over the place. And when Andy left his job, and he's very organized and systemized, he said, right, come on, we've got to systemize. So basically what I did was I split up the process into 5 steps: find it, fund it, finish it, fill it, and future-proof it. And I created a system for each of those in our own business, and I wrote it all down. And then I had a mentor at the time, and he said to me, that would make a great book. Why don't you publish it? So I published it. So it's only a small book, and you can get it, or I'll perhaps give you the links, and then if people want to get the books, they can do.
Yes, please.
And then this is my second book, Extraordinary Profits from Ordinary Properties. I'll perhaps do it over there.
Yep.
So this is a little bit of a thicker book. It goes into the 5-step system in a bit more detail and also talks a bit more about the history of HMOs and the future of HMOs. So I do a little bit more of deep dive on the HMO market, where we've come from, where we're going, a bit more context about me and my story as well. That's a little bit more of a detailed book. But yeah, if you want a fairly quick read, do the 101 Essential Tips. But if you're in for something a little bit more deep and meaningful with much more content, that's the one you want. And you can get both of those actually from Amazon. I've narrated both of them, so they're on Audible, and you can buy them on print on. I think actually the green one, Extraordinary Profits, you can get on print on demand. So I think that would be available in Australia, but I think the other one is only physical copy. So I'm not sure if that's available in Australia, but anyway, I can send you the links and people can have a look. And if they struggle, to get in touch with me. I'm sure I can send a bulk load to Sam, who's in Brisbane, and he can whiz them across to you.
What about Audible? Are they on Audible?
Yes, they're both on Audible,
Yeah.
and also they're both on Kindle. So if you've got a Kindle and you want to get the Kindle copy, the e-book, you can get them as e-books as well.
Fantastic. Wendy, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you. There was heaps of questions that I didn't even get a chance to ask you because we just chatted like crazy there. So let's do it again in the future.
Absolutely. We'll have to do part 2, won't we, Neil?
Yes, excellent. Wendy, thank you so much for your time and have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Hey, it's Neil here, and on October the 19th to the 22nd, I'm racing in the Cape to Cape mountain bike ride to help raise money for my sister's care home. Now, if you're getting value from the HMO Property Show and all of the other content that we put out there, I would really appreciate a donation to show your appreciation. So I will leave that with you guys. The link is in the show notes, and I hope you continue to get value and listen to the HMO Property Show. Peace.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you tune in the same time next week so you stay up to date with all the cash flow positive property updates.